You'll be fine, Claire. You're ruining the whole afternoon over a cupcake. That was my father's exact response after my sister secretly fed my diabetic 5-year-old daughter enough sugar to send her into a medical crisis. My mother laughed and said, "Honestly, the way you hover over that child, it's a wonder she can breathe." Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from and make sure you hit subscribe. What I'm about to share changed every assumption I had ever made about family. My name is Claire Morrison. I'm 29 years old, and up until 18 months ago, I believed that family was the one thing in life you could always count on. I believed it the way you believe in gravity. Not because you've tested it, just because it has always been there. I know better now. I work as a licensed dental hygienist at a pediatric practice in Columbus, Ohio. It's not a glamorous career by anyone's standard, but I love it. I spend my days with kids who are scared and anxious, and I've learned how to be steady for them even when I'm not steady inside. That skill would become the most important thing I owned in the months ahead. My daughter Sophie was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when she was 3 years old. She was so small when it happened, still carrying that baby softness in her cheeks. And I watched her get poked and prodded and hooked up to monitors while she looked at me with those enormous brown eyes like she was asking me to make it stop. I couldn't make it stop, but I could learn everything there was to know, and I did. I read every journal article, attended every support group, built a system of monitoring and meal management so precise that her pediatric endocrinologist called me one of the most informed parents she had ever worked with. Sophie wears a continuous glucose monitor on her upper arm. We call it her helper sticker. She knows what foods spike her levels. She knows she has to wait while I check her reading before eating at parties. At 5 years old, she handles it with more grace than most adults would. My sister Rachel is 32. She is the person my parents built their entire identity around. Rachel planned high-end corporate events, drove a white BMW she had traded up twice in 4 years, and had recently gotten engaged to a man named Brett who wore cufflinks to casual dinners. She had never wanted children, which was completely her right, but she had also never hidden the fact that she found Sophie's medical needs to be an enormous inconvenience. She called the glucose monitor the device, never by its name, never acknowledging what it actually did. At Christmas 2 years ago, she sighed loudly when I asked the caterer about sugar content in the appetizers and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Can't we just have one event that isn't completely orchestrated around the situation?" The situation. That was Sophie. My parents, Frank and Linda, had been married for 34 years and had spent most of those years perfecting the performance of the perfect family. My father built a regional chain of hardware stores from the ground up and wore his success like a second skin. My mother had been the president of every committee she had ever joined and took her social standing more seriously than most people take religion. Their home in Westerville was immaculate. Their lawn was professionally maintained, and every holiday gathering was photographed for the family album with the same meticulous attention as a magazine shoot. What happened outside the frame of those photographs was a different story entirely. I had gotten divorced from my ex-husband Derek the previous year. He was not a bad man, just someone who discovered 3 years into our marriage that he preferred his life without a child's medical needs, structuring every meal, every trip, every holiday. He relocated to Phoenix, sent child support reliably, and called Sophie on Sundays. That was the version of Derek I had made my peace with. The harder part was rebuilding alone, in a small 2-bedroom apartment, recalibrating everything I thought my life would look like. My parents had been financially supportive after the separation, covering Sophie's medical supplies 1 month when my insurance had a coverage gap, helping with the security deposit on the apartment. I was grateful. I also knew, in the part of myself I had learned not to examine too closely, that their help had always come with conditions that weren't written down anywhere but were enforced anyway. The Sunday everything fell apart was Mother's Day. Mom had requested a late afternoon brunch at the house. Her favorite china, her herb garden in full bloom for photos, the whole production. I had prepared for it the way I always prepared for family events. I brought Sophie's glucose kit, her emergency glucagon kit, 2 approved snacks, and I had texted my mother the previous evening to confirm there would be fruit, eggs, and plain breakfast items Sophie could eat safely without complication. My mother texted back a thumbs up emoji and nothing else. Rachel arrived with Brett and a tiered display of cupcakes from some boutique bakery downtown. The cupcakes were stacked on a marble stand and decorated with pink buttercream roses. They were objectively beautiful and entirely off-limits for Sophie. I noted them when I walked in, felt the familiar, quiet vigilance activate in my chest, and made a mental note to keep Sophie close. The morning went smoothly for a while. Sophie was delighted by my mother's garden and spent 20 minutes helping water the tomatoes. My father poured mimosas and told the same 3 stories about his first hardware store that he told at every gathering. Brett asked questions about commercial real estate investments, which made my father's eyes light up in a way that confirmed Brett had done his homework. Rachel floated through the rooms looking luminous and receiving the specific quality of attention my parents had always reserved for her. I checked Sophie's glucose at 11:30. It was a 112 textbook perfect. She ate the plate I had fixed her, scrambled eggs, a small bunch of grapes, 1 piece of turkey bacon. She was happy. She asked if she could have a cupcake, and I told her we would find her a special treat later, something I had brought from home. She accepted this the way she always did, without complaint, with the quiet trust that I would keep my word. I made a mistake at around 12:15. My mother called me into the kitchen to help her retrieve a serving dish from the top shelf of the pantry, and I was gone for less than 4 minutes. I know it was less than 4 minutes because I had just glanced at my phone before walking in. When I came back to the sunroom, Sophie was sitting in Rachel's lap. Rachel's finger was tracing the pink frosting on one of the boutique cupcakes. The cupcake had a large, neat bite taken out of it. Sophie's mouth had frosting at the corner. My body understood before my brain did. Every cell in me went cold. "What did she eat?" I asked, and my voice came out so flat and controlled that I barely recognized it. Rachel looked up with an expression I can only describe as satisfied. "Just a tiny bite." She kept asking, and honestly, Claire, she's 5. It's Mother's Day. How much did she eat? I was already reaching for Sophie, lifting her arm to check the sensor reading on my phone. 1 cupcake, maybe a little more. She wanted the one with the extra roses on top. 1 cupcake, maybe more. Those cupcakes were full sugar, full fat boutique confections with buttercream frosting that contained somewhere between 40 and 60 grams of carbohydrates each. Sophie's safe range for a snack was 15 grams with a measured insulin correction. Her system could not process that volume of sugar without a calculated dose of fast-acting insulin given in advance. Sophie's glucose reading came back at 287 and rising. "She needs insulin right now," I said, already pulling the kit from my bag. "Sophie, sweetheart, come sit with Mommy." "Goodness, Claire." My mother appeared in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands, watching me prepare the injection. "You don't have to do that right this second. We're in the middle of brunch. Her blood sugar is almost 300, Mom. Children's blood sugar fluctuates. It's completely normal. Not for a type 1 diabetic. Not like this." I gave Sophie her correction dose. She was starting to look flushed, a little glassy around the eyes. I knew those signs. I pulled her onto my lap and kept one arm around her while I watched the number on my phone with my whole body clenched. At the table, Rachel had resumed eating. Brett was telling a story about a weekend trip to Napa. My father refilled his mimosa. "You need to tell me exactly what she ate," I said to Rachel. Rachel turned to look at me with a patience that was not actually patience at all. "I told you. 1 cupcake. Maybe she had a second bite of mine. She was being so sweet about it, Claire. I'm not going to tell a 5-year-old no when she's looking at me like that. You know she's diabetic. I know you've made her condition the centerpiece of every gathering we've ever had." Rachel set down her fork. "I know that child has never once been allowed to just be a normal kid at a family event because of the way you manage every single thing she eats like a military operation. Because if I don't, she ends up exactly like this." I held up my phone showing the CGM reading. It was at 318 now. My father cleared his throat. "Rachel was just trying to make the little girl happy on Mother's Day. There's no reason to turn this into a scene." Sophie leaned against my chest and said her tummy felt wrong. I watched her color. I watched the number. I kept the phone in my hand like a lifeline and talked to Sophie in a quiet, steady voice about the cartoons she had watched that morning, about the tomatoes in Grandma's garden, about anything that would keep her calm and keep her breathing slow. But the reading climbed to 341 and I could feel a fine tremor in her small body that I knew was not right. "We need to go," I said, standing up with Sophie in my arms. "You're leaving?" My mother's voice carried the particular offense of someone whose stage management has been disrupted. "We haven't had dessert. I made a pavlova." "Sophie is not okay. We need to go." Rachel made a sound that was just barely a laugh. A breath through the nose, the corner of her mouth lifting. "You are so dramatic." I watched her eat a cupcake, not drain a soda bottle. "She looks completely fine." "She doesn't look fine," I said. "And you knew exactly what you were doing when you gave it to her." "Oh, here we go." My father pushed back from the table. The accusation portion of every family holiday with Claire. "I'm not accusing anyone. I'm telling you what happened. My daughter was left alone with Rachel for 4 minutes, and Rachel fed her something she knows is dangerous. Sophie is symptomatic. We're leaving." My mother set down her coffee cup with a pointed clink against the saucer. "You have always done this. Always found a way to make every occasion about you and your problems. Rachel drove 2 hours to be here, and you're going to make her feel awful because of a cupcake." I looked at my mother across the table, across the white linen and the china and the cheered cupcake stand with its pink roses. And I thought, I have driven to this house for 3 years since Sophie's diagnosis. I have texted ahead every single time. I have brought safe food, brought the kit, sat vigilant at every meal while everyone else relaxed because I was watching so they didn't have to. I had done all of that because I believed that family meant they would eventually meet me halfway. I picked up Sophie's bag and walked out. I drove to Nationwide Children's Hospital with my hand reaching back to hold Sophie's fingers across the center console while her CGM continued to climb. By the time we reached triage, her reading was 389. A nurse took one look at my daughter's flushed face and elevated heart rate and moved us through immediately. The attending physician was Dr. Chen, a compact, serious woman who listened to my explanation of the incident without interrupting. Her questions were precise and methodical. Time of last insulin dose, approximate carbohydrate amount ingested, duration of symptoms, weight, and most recent A1C. "Was this intentional?" she asked me quietly when the nurse had stepped out to retrieve supplies. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Rachel's face, that satisfaction, and the way she had said she kept asking, as if Sophie asking for a cupcake was a reasonable justification for ignoring a documented medical condition. "I believe so," I said. "Dr. Tu." Chen's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted. "I'm going to have our social workers speak with you. Given the documented nature of your daughter's condition and the circumstances you're describing, I'm required to flag this for review." That sentence landed on me like a stone dropping into still water. Mandatory review. Child Protective Services. My daughter's medical chart now included a flag because my own sister had fed her a cupcake and smiled about it. Sophie's blood sugar stabilized after 2 hours of careful management and IV fluids. The hyperglycemic episode had not caused lasting damage. Dr. Kever. Chen was clear about that, and I held on to that information the way you hold onto a rope in cold water. No lasting damage. She would be okay. But while my daughter was hooked up to a drip, and I was sitting beside her hospital bed with my hand wrapped around her small wrist, my phone buzzed steadily on the bedside tray. My mother. "You left without saying goodbye, and Rachel is in tears. This is not how adults handle things." My father. "Call us when you've calmed down. You embarrass the whole family in front of Brett." Rachel. 40 minutes after the others. "Diabetics eat sugar all the time." I looked it up. "You're manufacturing a crisis to punish me." There was not one question about Sophie. Not a single message that said, "How is she? Is she okay? What does she need?" I read every message twice. Then I put my phone face down on the tray and did not touch it again until Sophie was asleep. A social worker named Denise came to speak with me just after 7 in the evening. She was thorough and kind in equal measure, and she did not minimize anything I told her. I walked her through the diagnosis, the management protocol, the family history of dismissing Sophie's medical needs, the 3 years of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings where I had arrived prepared and watchful while everyone else treated my daughter's condition as a personality quirk I had invented. I told her about the pattern of Rachel's comments, the time she had handed Sophie juice boxes I had specifically said to keep away, the way my parents had consistently treated Sophie's diabetes as my parenting anxiety rather than a documented medical reality. Denise made careful notes throughout. What you're describing has characteristics of medical neglect facilitated by a third party, she said. The deliberate nature of what your sister did today, combined with the family's response, is something we take seriously. On the drive home, Sophie fell asleep within minutes, her head tipped against the window and the city lights moving softly across her face. I kept both hands on the wheel and made myself breathe slowly and steadily. At a red light on Broad Street, I thought about all the times I had convinced myself that Rachel's behavior was just carelessness, just thoughtlessness, just her fundamental inability to understand the reality of a child's medical needs. I thought about the juice boxes and the eye rolls and the sighs, and I understood, for the first time clearly, that it had never been carelessness. Careless people forget. Rachel had been deliberate. She had watched my daughter ask for a cupcake and decided that what I had built, all the careful systems and the constant vigilance and the years of sleepless nights monitoring Sophie's numbers, was something she could dismiss in 4 minutes to prove a point. I got Sophie into bed and sat in the kitchen with a notepad and wrote down every incident I could remember with dates, descriptions, and any witnesses who had been present. I filled 6 pages. When I finished, I made tea. I didn't drink and sat in the quiet of my apartment and accepted, fully and without flinching, what I had to do. Over the next 3 days, my parents called 11 times between them. My father's messages moved through impatience and into what he clearly believed was a reasonable ultimatum. I needed to call Rachel and apologize for leaving the way I had. I needed to acknowledge that my reaction had been disproportionate, and I needed to commit to attending Rachel and Brett's engagement dinner the following month. My mother's messages were a variation on a single theme, that I had always found ways to position myself as a victim, that my sensitivity was exhausting to everyone around me, that Rachel had done nothing that any normal aunt wouldn't do at a family celebration. I did not call them back. Instead, I called a friend from work, Patrice, who had been through a difficult custody situation 2 years earlier and knew more than most people about navigating family law. Patrice gave me the number of an attorney named Marcus Webb who specialized in family protective matters. I called Marcus the next morning and scheduled a consultation. Marcus reviewed the hospital documentation, the CGM data log that had recorded Sophie's glucose spike in precise timestamps, and the pages of notes I had written on my kitchen table. He was quiet and focused as he read, and when he set the papers down, he looked at me with a directness I found steadying. "The CGM log is significant," he said. "It is essentially an objective, time-stamped record of what happened to your daughter's body, combined with Dr. Jez Chen's documentation and the social worker's notes. You have a strong evidentiary foundation." He paused. "What's your goal here? Are you pursuing charges?" I had thought about that question for 3 days. I want Sophie protected. I want a legal record that establishes what happened so that if it ever happens again, there are no questions about pattern. Marcus nodded. "I'd recommend we file a formal complaint requesting a full CPS investigation and simultaneously pursue a protective order against your sister. Given the medical documentation, I believe we have solid grounds." I filed the paperwork with Marcus's guidance 4 days after the Mother's Day incident. The CPS investigation was opened within 48 hours. I was making Sophie's dinner 11 days later when someone knocked at my apartment door with the particular aggression of someone who has been building toward it for a while. I already knew before I checked the peephole. Rachel was in the hallway in a cream blazer, her hair perfectly done, her expression like weather about to change. I opened the door and stood in it. "I'm not asking to come in," she said, which meant she absolutely intended to come in. "I just need 5 minutes. Sophie is eating dinner, then she's fine." Rachel lowered her voice, but the sharpness didn't go anywhere. "You filed some kind of complaint. A government worker called Brett's mother. Do you have any idea how that looks? We are 3 months from our engagement party. I'm aware of the timeline. You need to withdraw it. Whatever you filed, whatever story you told them, you need to call it off." She shifted her weight and I noticed her jaw was working slightly, the way it did when she was working very hard to appear calmer than she was. "I gave a child a cupcake. That is the sum total of what happened." You gave a type 1 diabetic child unannounced, uncorrected sugar and watched her glucose spike while you continued eating, and you have never once asked if she was okay. She is obviously okay. She's eating dinner. She spent 4 hours in the hospital, which you could have avoided if you weren't. Rachel stopped. Started again. You have weaponized that child's medical condition for 3 years to make yourself the center of every family event. Everyone sees it, Claire. Mom and Dad, Brett, everyone. You use Sophie to make us feel like bad people so you can play the martyr. I heard my neighbor's door open slightly down the hallway. I had already, on the quiet advice of Marcus during a follow-up call, slipped my phone from my pocket and started recording before I opened the door. I said nothing. I let Rachel keep talking. If you don't withdraw the complaint and call our parents this week, I will make things very complicated for you. She said it with a precision that told me she had been rehearsing it. I know the office manager at your dental practice. I know people on the credentialing board. You want to make my life difficult over a cupcake. I can return the favor. Are you threatening my professional license? I'm explaining that actions have consequences. Mom and Dad have helped you financially for 3 years. That's not a small thing. And their patience is not unlimited. I took one breath. Then I said, I've been recording this conversation since I opened the door. The color in Rachel's face changed, not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies, but a specific quality of certainty left her expression and was replaced by something that looked, briefly, like fear. That's not, she stalked. You can't just... In Ohio, one-party consent means I can record any conversation I'm a participant in. My attorney explained that to me. Your attorney? Rachel said it the way people say something they need time to digest. You got an attorney over a cupcake. I got an attorney over my daughter's medical crisis and the threats you just made on my doorstep. I held her gaze steadily. I'm also gathering statements from other people who have been present when you've dismissed Sophie's condition. That's been a longer process than I expected, honestly, because there have been a lot of incidents to document. Rachel left without another word. I closed the door and stood in the hallway of my apartment for a long moment with my back against it, listening to Sophie humming something in the kitchen over the sound of her spoon hitting the bowl. I sent the recording to Marcus that evening. He called me 20 minutes later. This is useful, he said simply. She's admitted to the incident, made implicit threats against your livelihood, and made statements that demonstrate awareness of Sophie's condition. We'll include this with the complaint. He paused. I'd also recommend reaching out to your HR department preemptively before she does, just to establish a documented timeline on your end. I did that the next morning. My office manager, a steady woman named Carol who had 3 kids of her own, listened to a summary of the situation and told me she would note the conversation in my file and that my record at the practice was impeccable. She'd have nothing to report, Carol said, but I'm glad you told me. The CPS investigation moved quickly once the hospital documentation was submitted. The investigator assigned to our case, a man named Officer Hendricks, was methodical and thorough. He interviewed Dr. Chen, reviewed Sophie's full medical history, and conducted a formal interview with me that lasted nearly 2 hours. He was also, I learned later, attempting to schedule interviews with my parents and Rachel. My parents hired a family attorney within 48 hours of being contacted. Rachel did not respond to the first 2 interview requests. My parents called me during this period in a register I had not heard from them before. Not angry, exactly, but frightened. My mother said, "This has gotten out of hand, Claire." My father said, "There are lawyers involved now and it's completely unnecessary." Neither of them asked about Sophie. I found I was no longer surprised by that. What I did not expect was the call from my cousin Dana, my mother's brother's daughter, who I had not spoken to in over a year. Dana called on a Tuesday evening while Sophie was in the bath. "I heard something happened at your parents' house on Mother's Day," Dana said. "I wanted to check on you." I asked how she'd heard. She told me Rachel had told several people in the extended family that I had fabricated a medical emergency to get Rachel in trouble. That I had always been unstable since the divorce, and that I was using Sophie's diabetes as a weapon. "I don't believe her," Dana said flatly. "She did something similar to my nephew 2 years ago. My sister-in-law's son has a severe egg allergy and Rachel put egg in a dip at Easter and told everyone it was dairy-free. He had a reaction. Not as serious as what you're describing with Sophie, but deliberate. My sister-in-law reported it to no one because Rachel cried and my aunt convinced everyone it was an honest mistake. I sat down on the couch while Sophie sang to herself in the bathroom. Why didn't anyone say anything? Because your parents are very convincing, Dana said, and because it was easier not to. I added Dana's account to the documentation file Marcus and I had been building. There were now 4 separate incidents involving Rachel and children with documented medical or physical vulnerabilities. The pattern was precise and undeniable. This was not carelessness. It was something deliberate and repeated, and it had been protected by family money and my parents' social standing for years. The protective order was granted 6 weeks after Mother's Day. Rachel was legally prohibited from being within 150 feet of Sophie or me. My parents were not named in the order, but they were formally notified by the court that any contact they wished to have with Sophie would need to occur in a structured setting under conditions I approved. The consequences for Rachel extended as Marcus had suggested they might once the legal action became documented and visible. Brett's family, I was told through Dana, had a conversation with their son about what they had learned. The engagement was quietly postponed and then, 3 months later, ended. Rachel's event planning company faced a review after a former client connected the dots through court records that had become part of the public file. 2 nonprofit boards on which she had served as a volunteer coordinator asked her to step back. I took no satisfaction in any of it. What I felt was a complicated and exhausted grief for the family I had wanted Sophie to have. Grandparents who would delight in her. An aunt who would take her shopping and tell her she was remarkable. That family had never been available to us. What I had been holding on to for 3 years was the performance of it, and the performance had cost my daughter 4 hours in a hospital bed with an IV in her arm. My parents reached out through a family therapist 8 weeks after the incident, something I had not anticipated. The therapist was someone they had found independently without my involvement, and the fact that they had taken that step at all was significant enough that I agreed to an initial meeting. It was stilted and painful, and my mother spent half of it defending Rachel in language that the therapist gently and repeatedly redirected. But my father, at one point, looked at his hands on the table and said something I had not heard from him in 30 years of being his daughter. I have made everything about image for so long that I stopped seeing my own grandchild. He paused. I don't know how to undo that, but I'd like to try. We were nowhere near reconciliation. What we had was the beginning of an honest conversation, which was more than we had ever had before. I kept the meetings structured and infrequent and always with the therapist present. Sophie did not attend them. She did not need to be present for the work her grandparents needed to do on their own. It was summer when I realized how much had shifted. Sophie and I were at the community pool with Patrice and her 2 kids. A Saturday afternoon in July with the air thick and warm and the smell of sunscreen everywhere. Sophie was in the shallow end with Patrice's daughter Lily, the 2 of them absolutely absorbed in a project involving pool noodles that seemed to have very elaborate rules. Her glucose monitor blinked steadily on her arm. Her numbers even, and good. My neighbor Ryan had joined us. A high school history teacher, divorced, with an easy and patient manner that Sophie had responded to immediately in the way children sometimes respond to people who are genuinely interested in them. He sat beside me on the pool deck with 2 bottles of water, watching the kids. She's doing well, he said. She is. I watched Sophie negotiate something loudly with Lily about the pool noodle rules. She's been sleeping through the night again. The nightmares have been tapering. Good, he said, and he meant it without performance or obligation. I thought about what Dr. Chen had said to me at Sophie's follow-up appointment, 2 months after the incident. She had looked at Sophie's numbers, at the trend data on the CGM app, and said, "She is thriving. Whatever you're doing is working." I had thought about that word for weeks. Thriving. Not surviving, not managing, not compensating. Thriving. I had built a life that did not look the way I had once expected it to look. There was no dining room table set with fine china. There was no family that gathered without careful management. there was a small apartment with a dinosaur print pillowcase on Sophie's bed and a refrigerator covered in her drawings and a Sunday routine that involved the community pool and Patrice's family and sometimes Ryan. There was my daughter in the shallow end, healthy and loud and confident, negotiating pool noodle rules with the particular authority of a child who has learned that her voice is worth using. I had spent 3 years walking into my parents' house with my kit and my backup supplies and my quiet vigilance, hoping that if I managed enough variables, the environment itself would eventually become safe. I had believed that if I was careful enough, accommodating enough, patient enough, the family I wanted would materialize from the one I had. It took a hospital bill and a CGM WOG and 6 pages of notes on a kitchen table to understand that I had been protecting everyone in those rooms except the person who needed me most. Sophie splashed across the pool toward me and grabbed the edge, looking up with her face streaming water. Mom, Lily says pool noodles float because of science, but I think they float because they're magic. Who's right? I looked at her, really looked at her whole luminous face, her easy grin, the small sensor on her arm that helped me keep her safe. And something in my chest loosened in a way it hadn't in a very long time. You're both right, I said. Science is a kind of magic. She considered this with great seriousness, then launched herself back toward Lily. Ryan looked at me. I looked back at him and then at the water where my daughter was playing, and I let myself feel, without qualification, that we were going to be okay. That afternoon in the pool, watching Sophie negotiate and laugh and argue with the cheerful confidence of a child who has been consistently told her voice matters, I understood what I had been trying to protect from the moment we left that Mother's Day brunch. Not just her health, her understanding of what she deserved. Children learn what love looks like from the people who surround them first. I had needed Sophie to learn it from me before the world, or anyone in it, could teach her something different. The court order was still in place. The therapy sessions continued carefully and slowly. The work was ongoing and would be for a long time. But sitting there in the afternoon sun with Patrice on one side and Ryan on the other and my daughter's laughter carrying across the water, I understood that the hardest thing I had ever done, choosing my child over the family I had hoped to have, had been the only real choice all along. Have you ever had to draw a line between your child and someone you loved? I would genuinely love to hear your story in the comments, and if this resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Take care of the people who need you most, and take care of yourself while you do it.